I'm presumably fairly clear. Uh, how many of you folks are here because your professor told you you should come here? No? I was talking to people who were telling me about their classes before. Because I hate having an audience who isn't interested in the subject and being required. I get very bored in long speeches, so I'm not going to give one. I'm going to ask you to break all the time. I assumed I was going to have an audience that is into some of this stuff. If I get too technical or too geeky or too wonky, please warn me. The basic thing I'm going to put out to you, how do I move this? Yeah. Is that 90% of what you hear about wireless is nonsense. The spectrum shortage, well, Marty Cooper invented the cell phone, literally built the first one, made the first call. We've never had a spectrum shortage and we never will. Now, who in this room has heard otherwise, that there's a major spectrum problem? Okay, how many of you believe that's probably true? Well, that's why I'm talking, because what I'm coming up with, I've had a very interesting year. I got hired by the Marconi Foundation, and most of these guys are not usually wearing penguin suits. But they came together in Washington in October to honor one of them. That guy in the middle who's in a Nehru jacket instead of a penguin suit is Agraswamy Paul Raj. He invented MIMO in 1993. How many of you have ever used Wi-Fi or a recent mobile phone? They all have MIMO in it. MIMO uses 2, 3, 4, 50 antennas in order to get 2, 3, 4, 50 times the capacity. And most of the people talking about spectrum hasn't figured out what they're doing. I got hired by these folks to do some webinars. I organized some speeches. We've done some videos and so on. And the result is, I've been learning a hell of a lot. I sound much smarter than I am, because when I'm repeating this stuff, it's coming from people like Paul, Vint Cerf and Bob Kahn, you've probably heard of. They come up with a little product called TCP/IP. John Chaffee is responsible for DSL. Henry Samueli for cable modems and most of the Ethernet chips we've seen the last few years. Bob Lucky is here only for those of us with gray beards. Once upon a time, the fastest modem you could buy was 2400 baud, not kilobaud or megabits baud. And it was wonderful when we got to speed that up to 9600. That was Dr. of equalization. That was something Bob did way back when. He ran much of Bell Labs for 20 years after that. Okay. Andrea Goldschmidt of Stanford is one of the smartest engineers I've met. She hasn't won a Marconi Prize yet, probably because she's done important work in about 5 different areas instead of just one big breakthrough, and they don't know how to deal with that. But she said in one of the webinars I did, is wireless capacity can increase 50 to 100 times in the coming years. In fact, at the Marconi Symposium, we had a session on MIMO, and 10 years from now, does it multiply capacity 10 times or 100 times? And on that chat session, mostly agreeing with, were Paul Raj, Bob Lucky, John Chaffee, and a couple of people, one of whom, Thomas Marzetta, did MU-MIMO, which is really important if you care about connecting people who don't live in cities. Okay. Now, why do we care about any of this stuff, other than pointing out to a lot of people at the FCC and $5 million a year Washington lobbyists that they're talking total nonsense? Anybody who said spectrum crisis, such as the empty suit with no balls named Julius Janikowski, who ran the FCC for 4 years, just didn't know what they were talking about. But it really matters. What would change in the world if 2 things were true? First of all, if on your iPhone or your $100 smartphone, you had the capacity of a current fiber line. That's enough to watch everything you watch on TV and do just about anything you ever imagined doing on the internet. Am I not talking close enough to the mic?
Talking too close to the mic.
Okay, so let us move. Jolie, incidentally, is responsible for more interesting talks on the internet than anyone else on earth, I believe. He's recorded a whole pile of stuff. Nobody watches it because very few of us are deeply into this enough to watch it, but let's stop. Now, is there anybody in the audience who can explain why we have a spectrum crisis or what it means? Anybody? Oh, God. Okay, Jolie. I'm hearing, I can't hear what you're saying. What does analog have to do with it when we moved all the digital a while back in 3G and now 4G and soon 5G? And what he's talking about there is something my old roommate Jerry Nadler wound up in the middle of. Jerry is now a congressman whose territory includes Broadway. A lot of people on Broadway, and when you're talking about a big Broadway musical, they're using 40 different microphones. They're all hooked up analog, remarkably inefficiently. It would be much better and cheaper to solve that problem, but for the moment, there's arguing for spectrum. The main thing that's going on is you're dealing with how does AT&T and Verizon make money, and how do we organize the system for them to do that, which is what Washington is about, and how do we have a better internet for all of us and people around the world? Let me go down a bit. Do I have it here? Somewhere in here, I thought I had my... I'm looking for my Africa slide. Here we are. When do you think there will be more internet users in Africa than in the United States? How many think almost never? That's the general opinion that I hear. How many think about 15 or 20 years from now? How many think 5 or 10 years from now?
That's what you call internet.
Yep. And I say somebody who does email, Facebook, can occasionally watch video, and does most of what we do on the internet is on the internet. The actual time is almost surely about 3 years from now. I worked this out with Cisco numbers. They have the VNI, which is some of the best raw data out there. What's going on is that there are 1 billion Africans and 315 Americans. At this point, there are 700 million mobile subscribers in Africa. That really means about 400 million people being connected because a lot of people have 2 SIMs. As smartphones become cheaper, soon more than 300 million of them will be connected in Africa with people on the internet, and they may have only 5 or 6 inch screens instead of 10 or 20 inch screens. But if you're younger than I am and your eyes are pretty good, i.e. if you're like most people in this audience, a 6-inch screen, you can do most of what you want to do on the internet just fine. They're going to be on the internet. So one of the questions I'm trying to find the answer for is what will change when there are more Africans than Americans on the internet? And in fact, I'm just back from 2 weeks in Busan, Korea, the ITU meeting, where I knew nothing was going to happen and nothing happened, but I got the chance to ask that question of a whole lot of people, from US ambassadors to Koreans to several dozens of the Africans. And frankly, almost none of them believed the 2017 date until I explained where it came from, and they all said, oh yeah, everybody's getting these smartphones. How many people believe after I've said that we will in just a few years have more Africans than Americans on the internet? We will see in 3 years. I guarantee I make a mistake. Anybody want to challenge me on that? Go ahead, sir.
I don't know. In 3 years, I'll challenge you.
So what's the odds and who's the escrow?
Set something up, and I'm not rich enough to bet a whole lot, but I'll say that within plus or minus 3 years plus or minus a year, the number will be there. I think we see someone in the back who studied some of this stuff.
I actually just read a post from Dana Boyd this morning, which actually talked about what the internet in Africa is like now. For those who do have the internet, there are a large number of email providers, Western companies that will block country-level domains from Africa because basically Africa is associated with spam farms. So it's not even a matter of just are there physical connection, but what are they able to access if they're not given the same sort of treatment that internet users in the U.S. are.
Okay, and that's one of the reasons I'm glad this is sponsored by the Internet Society. The Internet Society has gone from being a pleasant place for people to hang out to a player in internet governance in the last 5 years. That has to do with geopolitics that will bore all of you, so I won't get to it. If, in fact, the US, which controls these rules on the internet, and the US and the big European companies, which are the ones who block or don't block, were doing such a thing, well, bloody well, the Internet Society should be jumping in hard, and that sounds like something important. In practice, there's not much of it. I could be sitting in Kenya and nobody would be noticing the difference compared to when I'm in New York. If Dana found a couple of examples about that, Dana is brilliant. Dana, which is spelled D-A-N-A-H, Boyd, all in lower cases, is one of the most brilliant and fascinating people who write about and talk about the internet. I think she works for Microsoft now. She has been writing for she's been writing since she was a little more than a teenager, 10 or 15 years ago, about how teenagers use the internet. And she's always thought of things that are not obvious to other people. Always worth knowing. Now, who's this who has just come in? And I'm seeing somebody there who I thought was somebody I recognized, but I don't think is who I thought it was.
Jeff Hollins.
Have you ever been prosecuted by the SEC?
I haven't had the occasion. I assume that my phone is tapped, but after Snowden, most of us should assume our phone is tapped. I knew that my phone was probably tapped because 2 years ago at Wicket, I made a friend who connected with me and Link Up a month later. He happened to be the number 2 guy in the Russian group at Wicket, and I'm sure if the FBI was at all competent, they were watching me after that just automatically. I didn't have anything terribly interesting to say, so I'm not particularly worried about that, but they are. Okay, let me throw this out to you though. What is going to change in what happens on the internet if most of the people on the internet are not white and from rich countries? I can tell you that's going to happen, and I can explain why wireless is going to make it so, and so on. But I think that's more interesting to most of you than the technical bit about wireless. Somebody must have thoughts. I see an Asian woman with glasses about 5 rows. Are you Asian? Can I tell from here successfully? No, I'm not sure. I see somebody who doesn't have the same pink skin that I do. What do you think about how the internet is run now and who's on the internet? It's not your obligation to be put on the spot just because you're sitting here. But I'm kind of angry on this because I've been watching the US take a white man's burden position there and fighting really hard to keep the rules of the internet exactly the way we set them up 15 years ago, which favors us in a lot of ways. And we haven't accepted the fact, and I think I do have the chart here. Yeah. On this chart, we have the number of people with mobile connections at this point in the world. That little one there, the US, is 9.1%. All of Western Europe is about the same. When you look at it, already, China and India are half the mobile connections in the world, and soon will be half of the internet users. China already has twice as much as we do. That becomes very interesting. We're still ahead of Indonesia and Brazil and Russia, though. Put the three together, and they outdo us. And the technology is there. Now, what would happen if instead of having a lousy 5 megabits and a 10 gigabit cap, you had 100 megabits on your cell phone and a cap of, say, 500 gigabits, enough to watch all, 150 hours of TV a month? How does that change things? Anybody there able to think like that? David, you're thinking something.
It allows a leapfrog of infrastructure development.
And that's what all this stuff before that is, explains how we're getting to, but I decided to hold off on the technical stuff, and I'll go back to it if you want happily. But what if